June 25th, 1533. Inside Westhorpe Hall, a Tudor princess lay fading, her body wasted by a relentless cough. She was Mary Tudor, sister to Henry VIII, once praised as the most dazzling beauty in Europe. At just 37, she died quietly of tuberculosis. No grand ceremony, no royal triumph, only silence. Her fate is a stark reminder. Crowns can glitter like sunlight on steel, yet behind that shine, they can also chain the heart and consume the flesh. The year was 1496. England was still trembling from the echoes of civil war. The Wars of the Roses had torn the country apart, left fields soaked in blood, and dynasties shattered like glass. Out of that chaos, a fragile peace had been built by Henry VII and his queen, Elizabeth of York. Their marriage united the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. From that fragile union, a new dynasty emerged. A dynasty that would dominate English history. Into this uncertain peace came a child, Mary Tudor. She was the youngest daughter of Henry VII, the last-born princess of a family forged in battle, now dressed in the clothes of peace. Her birth was more than a family celebration. It was a political symbol. Every royal child was a statement to Europe. The Tudor line was strong, the crown secure, the dynasty legitimate. Mary grew up in the golden glow of her mother's affection and her father's cold calculation. Elizabeth of York, remembered for her grace and beauty, passed both to her daughter. But Henry VII, cautious and ever aware of politics, saw Mary not as a girl with laughter in her eyes, but as an asset. A rose, perhaps the most brilliant rose in his Tudor garden, to be plucked and presented when alliances demanded. From her earliest days, Mary was taught not just how to walk or how to smile, but how to be admired. She learned music. She could play the lute with elegance, her fingers moving like whispers over the strings. She mastered languages: French, Latin, the tongues of diplomacy. Even her bearing was shaped for spectacle. Her posture, her dress, her voice, all honed to impress envoys, to dazzle ambassadors, to confirm that England had treasures more valuable than gold. Daughters who could bind kings together. And Mary dazzled. Venetian diplomat Sebastiano Giustiniani wrote in awe, "She is the most beautiful creature in England, and one of the most beautiful women in Europe." Others echoed the same: fair skin, bright eyes, auburn hair that caught the sunlight. To Europe's courts, she was no mere princess. She was the face of a dynasty, a jewel that could be set in any crown. But beauty, for a Tudor woman, was never her own. It was a weapon forged for others to wield. As a child, Mary played in the gardens of Greenwich Palace. She ran, she laughed, she sang. Yet always, behind her, there were eyes. Courtiers noting her grace, her wit, her composure. Ambassadors reporting her growth, measuring her value. Even in childhood, she lived under the weight of expectation. Every smile, every word, was currency in the great game of kings. Her siblings were no less marked by destiny. Her elder brother Arthur was groomed as heir to the throne, married to Catherine of Aragon in the hope of binding England to Spain. Her younger brother Henry, the Spare, grew restless with ambition and appetite. History would know him as Henry VIII. Between these two great poles of duty and hunger, Mary's place seemed gentle, secondary. But appearances deceive. For a princess, the smaller crown of marriage could weigh just as heavily as the golden one placed upon a king's brow. Mary's life was never her own. The court adored her beauty, admired her charm, praised her accomplishments. But these were not gifts meant for her joy. They were investments, carefully cultivated. She was groomed for a stage far greater than any English garden. She was destined to leave her home, her country, her family, and be transplanted into foreign soil. She would not bloom for herself, but for others. As she grew into her teenage years, the political stakes only grew sharper. Europe was a chessboard, its kings and queens the pieces. France and Spain, ever at odds. England, a smaller power, had to move carefully. And Mary, radiant, admired, desired, became the most valuable piece her father held in reserve. One moment she was promised to the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, another to the heir of France. Negotiations rose and fell like tides, and through them all, Mary's name was written again and again in treaties she never signed. She was a princess, but she was also a contract. Her face the parchment, her body the ink. And yet, there are glimpses of Mary herself in the records. Not just the pawn, but the person. Those who met her noted her wit, her humor. She could charm with ease, could disarm with laughter. There is warmth in those reports, as if she carried not only the burden of beauty, but also the grace of a soul unwilling to be crushed entirely by politics. She had spirit. She had desires. She was alive. But life in the Tudor court was a performance, and performances end. For Mary, childhood was not a dawn stretching into day. It was a stage being set, curtains rising, lights burning, a play written not by her, but by kings and counselors. And in that play, her role was already cast. She would be the princess whose beauty was too bright to keep at home, too valuable to waste on her own happiness. She was England's daughter, but never her own. The year was 1514. Mary Tudor was 18. She was young, dazzling, and restless. Yet the crown had decided her fate long before she could lift her eyes to meet it. England needed peace. France needed security. And Mary, beautiful beyond description, became the price of that fragile balance. Her brother Henry VIII had just ascended the throne, bold and vigorous, eager to prove himself as a king of consequence in Europe. His counselors whispered of alliances, of treaties, of the eternal rivalry between France and Spain. England could not stand alone, not yet. And so the solution emerged, simple on parchment, but brutal in reality. Mary would marry the French king, Louis XII. Louis was nearly 60, old by the standards of the age, his body worn down by years of rule, by illness, by exhaustion. Yet he was still a king, and that made him powerful. For Henry, this marriage was not about love or joy, but about prestige. To send his sister, the most admired woman in Europe, into the French court was to announce that the Tudors had arrived, that England was not a minor kingdom, but a rising force. For Mary, it was a sentence. She wept. Chroniclers tell us she pleaded with her brother, begged for release. She had promised him once. She would obey, she would marry as commanded, but only if afterward she was allowed to choose her own path. Henry had agreed in words, but words bend easily under the weight of power. The preparations began. The English court dressed the princess in silks, adorned her with jewels, polished her image until she shone like a star meant to cross the channel. Ambassadors described her as radiant, the perfect bride. Songs were written, prayers recited, treaties signed. But beneath the gold and velvet, a young woman trembled. She sailed to France in October of 1514. The journey itself was a performance, a display of magnificence. Ships carried her across the channel like a living treasure. The French court awaited her with anticipation, curious to see if the rumors of her beauty were true. And when she arrived in Abbeville, the truth stunned them. Mary was breathtaking, glowing with the vitality of youth, her eyes bright, her hair gleaming like fire. Louis XII, gray-haired and weary, stood beside her. The contrast was almost cruel. He leaned on canes, his body weakened by age. She stood tall, flushed with health, barely 18. They were joined in marriage on October 9, 1514, in a ceremony grand enough to silence doubts, at least for a moment. Trumpets sounded. Nobles bowed. Europe took notice. But the pageantry could not conceal reality. On their wedding night, the courtiers whispered that Mary wept. Alone, she faced a man old enough to be her grandfather, a man whose body had been worn thin, whose breath rattled, whose presence filled her not with love, but with dread. It was not a marriage. It was a bargain sealed in flesh. Louis tried to enjoy his prize. He paraded her beauty before the court, dressed her in jewels, boasted of his young bride. But his health crumbled quickly. He was exhausted, overwhelmed by the demands of keeping pace with a wife so young and admired. Less than 3 months after the wedding, on the first day of 1515, Louis XII collapsed and died. Mary Tudor, not yet 19, was left a widow. It should have been liberation, freedom from the man she had not wanted, freedom from the weight of a marriage that had been little more than a political transaction. But widowhood was not freedom for a royal woman. It was another cage. The French court eyed her with suspicion. She was now the Dowager Queen of France. Her beauty remained dazzling, but it was also dangerous. Who would claim her next? Who would use her body as a bridge for treaties, as a pawn for kings? She was watched, guarded, managed. The young English rose was still not her own. And yet, within that cage, Mary found resolve. She remembered her promise to Henry. She remembered his assurance that after one political marriage, she would have the right to choose. She intended to claim that right, no matter the cost. Her time in France had shown her the raw mechanics of politics, how women's lives could be reduced to parchment, how beauty could become a weapon sharpened by others, how marriage was less about hearts than about borders, and she despised it. She would not let herself be bartered again, not without a fight. The widowed Mary remained in France for a short while, draped in black, playing her role. Courtiers whispered about her composure, about her grace, about her haunting sadness. But behind closed doors, she was already planning. She would seize the rarest of Tudor luxuries, a choice of her own. But that choice would come at a terrible cost. For now, the world saw only the spectacle: a young widow draped in velvet mourning, a queen without a king, a jewel without a crown. England and France weighed her value, debated her next fate. Mary endured it in silence, her eyes lowered, her heart shielded. She had learned one bitter lesson. She was not a daughter, not a sister, not even a wife. She was a treaty in human form, and treaties, like roses, could be torn apart in an instant. Mary Tudor returned from France in mourning black. She had been Queen of France for less than 3 months, and now she was a widow at 19. Europe might have seen her as a symbol of tragedy, but Mary did not intend to remain in the role that others had written for her. She had made a promise to herself and to her brother. Before leaving for France, she had begged Henry VIII for one concession. If she agreed to the marriage with Louis XII, she asked, would he allow her to choose her next husband? Henry, impatient but indulgent, had said yes. Perhaps he thought the promise would be forgotten. Perhaps he assumed that, once widowed, Mary would again be placed into the service of politics. But Mary remembered. In France, away from her brother's court, she found not only determination but also desire. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, had been sent to escort her back to England. He was no king, no crowned prince. He was Henry's closest friend, a soldier of stature, a courtier admired for his courage and charisma. And he was the man Mary loved. Their affection had begun long before France. Whispers at court suggested a bond between them even before her marriage to Louis. But such love had been impossible, forbidden by rank and circumstance. A princess of England could not marry a mere duke without permission. And yet, in the twilight of her widowhood, Mary chose to risk everything. In Paris, surrounded by suspicion, she made a fateful choice. She and Charles Brandon were secretly married. Some say it was an impulsive decision, driven by fear that she would be forced into another political marriage. Others insist it was passion, a long-suppressed love finally breaking through. Whatever the truth, their act was unprecedented. A princess of England, a former queen of France, had married in defiance of her king. When the news reached Henry VIII, his fury was volcanic. This was not merely a breach of etiquette. It was treason. Royal marriages were instruments of diplomacy. To take such a step without the king's consent was to insult his authority, to threaten his alliances, to expose England to ridicule. The penalty for such disobedience was death. Mary knew it. Brandon knew it. They risked the axe for love. Henry's counselors urged punishment. To let such rebellion pass unchallenged would set a dangerous precedent. If a princess could marry where she pleased, why not others? Yet Henry was torn. Mary was not only his subject, she was his sister, and Charles Brandon was his closest friend. To destroy them would wound him as much as it would the realm. A compromise was reached. The couple would live, but at a cost. Mary and Brandon were forced to pay an enormous fine. Some reports suggest as much as £24,000, a staggering sum for the time. It nearly ruined them financially, a burden that would haunt their household for years. They were also required to surrender many of Mary's jewels, gifts from her time as Queen of France. These treasures, symbols of her brief reign, were taken back into the crown's possession. The price of survival was humiliation. The scandal spread across Europe. Ambassadors reported the story with astonishment. A princess of England, once bartered as a jewel for diplomacy, had seized her own fate. Some admired her courage, others scorned her recklessness. For Mary, the judgment of courts mattered little. She had won her choice. She had married the man she loved. But love within the Tudors was never free of chains. From the moment of their marriage, she and Charles Brandon lived under the shadow of Henry's disapproval. Though he eventually forgave them, the sting of betrayal lingered. They would never fully regain his trust. And the fine, the debts, the constant need to maintain appearances, these became the background of their life together. Still, for Mary, this union mattered. After years of being treated as a pawn, she had finally played a move of her own. She had risked disgrace and death to seize something personal, something real. The cost was high, but the prize was love. And yet, even in love, there was bitterness. Mary's rank never ceased to remind her of what she had lost. She was no longer a queen. She was a duchess. No longer the radiant centerpiece of international diplomacy, but a noble woman confined to the quieter world of Suffolk estates. For a woman once hailed as the most beautiful in Europe, admired in courts from Venice to Paris, the descent was sharp. Historians often debate whether Mary regretted her choice. Some claim she found happiness in her marriage, that her bond with Brandon was genuine, tender, and sustaining. Others argue that her life became one of quiet frustration, weighed down by debts, isolation, and a lingering sense of having fallen from greatness. The truth, as always, is likely both. But one thing is certain. Mary Tudor had crossed a line that few women of her rank dared to cross. She had chosen passion over politics, and for that she would carry the mark of scandal for the rest of her life. Her story, in this moment, transformed. No longer the obedient daughter or the silent bride, she became the rebellious sister, the princess who defied the crown, the queen who gambled her honor for love. Europe remembered the beauty of her face. England remembered the defiance of her act. And Mary herself remembered the price she paid. Each time creditors came knocking. Each time her brother turned cold. Each time she was reminded that in choosing her heart, she had lost her crown. The Tudor rose still bloomed, but its petals were stained. Mary Tudor was no longer a queen. She was no longer the radiant jewel of diplomacy, no longer the bride paraded before Europe as a prize of peace. She was the Duchess of Suffolk, wife to Charles Brandon, and her life shifted from the spectacle of courts to the more modest reality of estates and debts. It was not an easy descent. For a woman who had been Queen of France, the shift from glittering palaces to the countryside of Suffolk must have felt like exile. The gowns were simpler. The halls were colder. The crowds of courtiers who once bowed and whispered in awe no longer lined her path. Instead, there were creditors, land stewards, household accounts that never quite balanced. Mary and Charles Brandon loved one another, but love did not pay for jewels or horses or retainers. They had been fined heavily for their reckless marriage, and the debts clung to them like shadows. Brandon, though a capable soldier and loyal companion to Henry VIII, was not a wealthy man by royal standards. He had land, he had title, but he did not have endless gold. Together, the couple learned to scrape, to sell, to borrow. A princess once praised as the most beautiful in Europe, now negotiated with lenders. She sold pieces of jewelry that had once sparkled on her in the French court. She parted with parcels of land, the very markers of aristocratic security. There is a bitterness in these details. A woman groomed for crowns now counting coins, her dignity traded away piece by piece. Still, Mary and Brandon had children, and their presence softened the sharp edges of disappointment. Francis, Eleanor, Henry, and others who did not survive infancy. Each birth was both joy and toll. Every child meant another drain on Mary's fragile body, another reminder that in Tudor England, motherhood was as dangerous as war. The love between Mary and Charles was real, but it was strained by their circumstances. They quarreled over money. They quarreled over status. They quarreled, at times, over the very decision that had united them. For Charles, the marriage had been daring, even romantic. For Mary, it had been survival, a way to seize a measure of control. But the aftermath left them bound to one another by something heavier than passion: debt. And debt gnaws. At court, their place was diminished. Mary no longer stood beside queens and kings as an equal. She was a sister tolerated, a duchess present on occasion, but never central. The glittering crown that once rested on her head in France was now gone, and with it, the sheen of power. When she walked the corridors of Henry's palaces, she did so not as a queen, but as a reminder of scandal. It wounded her pride. There are glimpses of her bitterness in letters and accounts. She clung fiercely to Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first queen, whom she respected and defended. She despised Anne Boleyn, the ambitious woman who would soon replace Catherine and fracture the very fabric of the Tudor dynasty. Mary saw in Anne not only a threat to Catherine, but also a mirror of her own fate. A woman bound to a crown that would one day betray her. Mary, though stripped of her own power, seemed to recognize in Anne the same cruel game of politics that had consumed her. In the Suffolk countryside, life unfolded in slower rhythms. The grand feasts of Paris and London were replaced with household banquets, still noble but far less dazzling. The estates of Westhorpe and others became her world. She rode in gardens, she heard music in smaller halls. She raised her children in the shadow of both love and constant financial worry. Yet, there is a strange dignity in this decline. Mary, who had once been the glittering rose of Europe, learned what it was to live without constant adoration. She discovered the quiet strength of endurance. To outsiders, she was no longer the center of attention. To her family, she was mother, wife, duchess, flawed, burdened, but present. Still, the memories of what she had been must have haunted her. To have been queen, even briefly, is to know the highest peak of status. To be forced down from it, to live among creditors and whispers of disgrace, must have been a daily wound. For Mary, the memory of her short reign in France was both treasure and torment, a reminder of what once was and what would never be again. Charles Brandon remained loyal, though ambitious. He continued to serve Henry, to fight in wars, to maintain his influence as best he could. Mary stood by him, but her heart was never entirely reconciled. She had chosen love over politics, but the love had demanded a price. Each bill unpaid, each jewel sold, each cold reception at court reminded her of what she had surrendered. It is here that her story begins to change in tone. No longer the glittering rise of a princess admired across Europe, but the slow erosion of a woman living with the consequences of her choices. She was not broken yet, but the cracks had begun to show. Mary Tudor, once the brightest rose of the Tudor garden, now lived not in splendor, but in survival. Her story, from this point forward, would not be about crowns or thrones. It would be about endurance, and endurance, for a Tudor woman, was its own kind of tragedy. Mary Tudor may have lived in Suffolk, away from the daily intrigues of her brother's court, but she was never truly free of the Tudors. No one born into that family ever was. The crown was not just a golden band. It was a web, binding every sibling, every cousin, every child into its knots of power, rivalry, and suspicion. Mary, proud by nature, carried her grievances openly. And her greatest grievance had a name: Anne Boleyn. When Henry VIII began his affair with Anne, Mary recoiled. She had known Anne in earlier years, when the Boleyns were still rising, when Anne was merely a lady-in-waiting with clever eyes and sharp ambition. To Mary, Anne represented the very danger she had always feared in court politics, a woman who could destroy others to build herself higher. Mary's loyalty was to Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first queen, her sister-in-law, the woman who had shared her triumphs and tragedies. Catherine had married Henry's elder brother Arthur first, and after Arthur's death, wed Henry himself. She had endured miscarriages, stillbirths, years of anxiety, yet she remained steadfast. To Mary, Catherine embodied dignity, endurance, and the kind of faith that could not be shaken even by royal cruelty. So when Henry turned from Catherine to Anne, Mary took sides. She despised Anne, not only for what Anne did to Catherine, but for what Anne represented: ambition without loyalty, charm without sincerity, a hunger for the crown that eclipsed even love. To Mary, It was poison. Letters and court records suggest Mary withdrew more and more from the court as Anne's star rose. She avoided ceremonies. She refused appearances. She would not smile at the woman she believed was destroying her family's honor. And Henry noticed. The once beloved sister, the sister he had forgiven after her scandalous marriage to Charles Brandon, was now a source of irritation. Henry, consumed by his obsession with Anne, had little patience for dissent. Those who opposed Anne's rise were brushed aside, sometimes even destroyed. For Mary, the cost was isolation. She was not alone in her dislike. Many of the nobility whispered against Anne. Many of the people muttered their loyalty to Catherine. But Mary's opposition carried a special sting because it came from blood. She was Henry's sister. Her silence was not neutral. It was defiance. At home in Suffolk, her bitterness grew. She was not merely disillusioned by Anne. She was disillusioned by Henry himself. This was the brother who had once promised to protect her. The brother who had pardoned her for her defiance. The brother she had loved, even when his temper raged. Now, she saw him abandoning a loyal wife, embracing a dangerous mistress, and reshaping the very soul of the English court. The Tudors had always been a family of contradictions, fierce loyalty and sudden betrayal, grand gestures and ruthless cruelty. Mary had lived through it all. But with Anne's arrival, the contradictions became unbearable. There is a passage in one letter, preserved from the early 1530s, that captures her despair. She wrote of the falsehood of the court and her weariness of its endless games. She confessed to preferring the silence of her estates to the noise of politics. Her words reveal not only her anger, but her exhaustion. The vibrant young woman who once dazzled Europe now sounded worn, defeated, almost resigned. The conflict with Anne was not simply personal. It deepened the rift between Mary and Henry. It separated her from the family she had once been central to. And it added another weight to her already heavy burdens of debt, fading health, and diminishing status. The irony is striking. Mary, once the most admired Tudor woman in Europe, reduced to the margins of her own family story. She had been a queen. She had defied kings for love. And now she lived as a near recluse, her influence stripped away, her words unwelcome, her loyalty unrewarded. Even Charles Brandon, loyal husband though he was, could not shield her from the storm. He continued to serve Henry, to appear at court, to bow and smile as politics demanded. Mary, however, held her ground in disdain. She would not bend, not even to protect herself. And that stubbornness cost her. History does not record dramatic confrontations between Mary and Anne, though the possibility lingers. Instead, it records her withdrawal, her silence, her fading presence. In a court that thrived on visibility, absence was its own kind of rebellion. By not playing the game, Mary declared her disgust, but in doing so, she also erased herself. For Henry, her opposition became a minor irritation. For Anne, it was likely a private satisfaction to see the once brilliant princess dimmed and forgotten. And for Mary, it was a slow unraveling of the life she had once imagined. Conflicts in the Tudor court were rarely resolved. They lingered, festering, turning siblings into strangers and friends into enemies. For Mary, the conflict was not just with Anne Boleyn. It was with the very system that had defined her life, a system where women were traded, discarded, and silenced when they no longer served their purpose. She had once been a rose, celebrated for her bloom. Now she was a thorn, quietly resented, quietly avoided, quietly fading. Her body, too, had begun to betray her. The cough, the fatigue, the sharp pains in her chest. But that story belonged to the shadows of her later years. For now, in the 1520s and early 1530s, the conflict that consumed her was less about illness and more about betrayal. Betrayal by her brother, betrayal by the court, betrayal by the crown itself. The Tudor rose was wilting, not from lack of beauty, but from lack of place. It began quietly, a cough, persistent, dry at first, then deeper, harsher, cutting through her nights like a blade. At first, Mary thought little of it. The English winters were cruel, the damp air settling into the lungs of even the strongest. But this cough did not leave. It clung, it grew, it hollowed her body from within. By the late 1520s, the transformation was visible. The once radiant princess, admired by diplomats and poets, began to wither. She lost weight. Her cheeks, once flushed with the warmth of youth, grew pale, sunken. Her eyes, still bright, now carried shadows beneath them, as if sleepless nights had carved themselves into her very face. The whispers began. "She is consumed by a continual cough," one observer wrote, "and a decline that no physician can arrest." In Tudor England, medicine was little more than hope wrapped in ritual. Doctors prescribed bleeding, herbal tonics, prayers. Nothing worked. Consumption, what we call tuberculosis, was a death sentence. It did not kill swiftly like plague. It killed slowly, invisibly, dragging its victims through months, even years, of exhaustion. The body wasted away, piece by piece, while the mind remained cruelly aware of its own fading. Mary knew what was happening. She had seen it before. Many in her world had. The disease was so common that its signs were instantly recognized. The thin frame, the hacking cough, the crimson stain of blood on a handkerchief. It was called the White Plague for the pallor it left, the ghostly hue it painted on faces. And for Mary, there was no escaping its grip. Each pregnancy had weakened her further. She bore at least 4 children, and though 2 daughters survived, Frances and Eleanor, the toll on her body was immense. Tudor women often gave their health, even their lives, in the service of childbirth. For Mary, already fragile, the strain opened the door wider to illness. She was never the same after her confinements. Life at Westhorpe Hall became quieter, more withdrawn. She appeared less frequently in public. Her absence from court was noted, but not mourned. Henry was too consumed with Anne Boleyn, too distracted by his battles with the church, to worry over his sister's failing health. Mary slipped from the center of history into its margins. But illness does not stay hidden forever. Visitors to Westhorpe described her as diminished, still graceful, still dignified, but wrapped in a melancholy that seemed as physical as her sickness. She moved more slowly. She spoke less. Even her laughter, once described as bright and disarming, grew rare. The vibrant rose of the Tudor garden was wilting before their eyes. And yet, she endured. There is something haunting in the endurance of the dying. Mary did not collapse suddenly. She lingered. For years she fought her body, refusing to surrender. She wrote letters. She oversaw her household. She raised her daughters as best she could. But behind every act of normalcy lay the weight of breathlessness, of fatigue, of pain. Consumption is cruel not only to the victim, but to those who watch. Charles Brandon must have seen her fading and known he could do nothing. Their children must have sensed the shadow, the quiet dread that haunted the halls. Servants, courtiers, visitors, all witnessed the slow unraveling of a woman once celebrated across Europe. And Mary herself, she must have felt the bitterness of it. To have been admired for her beauty, her vitality, her presence. And now to watch those very things stripped away day by day. To cough into a silk handkerchief and see the scarlet blot that marked her doom. To feel strength draining and know that no crown, no title, no love could buy reprieve. It was not only her body that sickened, it was her spirit. The political conflicts with Henry, the bitterness toward Anne Boleyn, the isolation from court, all of it compounded the illness. She had once lived in glittering halls, surrounded by music and color. Now she moved through dim chambers, her world narrowed to the rhythm of coughs and prayers. She was only in her 30s, yet she felt centuries old. By 1530, those around her must have known the truth. She would not live long. The question was not if she would die, but when. And still, the world moved on. England was gripped by scandal as Henry fought for his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Europe trembled with wars and alliances. The Reformation tore at the fabric of Christendom. In such turbulence, one fading princess was a footnote. Her illness, her suffering, her slow decline, all of it unfolded in silence, ignored by a world too busy with crowns and wars. But silence does not mean insignificance. Mary Tudor's illness revealed the brutal truth of her age. Women, no matter how beautiful, no matter how royal, were expendable. Their bodies were used for marriage, for childbirth, for alliances, and when those bodies broke, they were left to crumble in obscurity. The rose was fading, yes, but it faded in a way that told a story larger than her own. It spoke of the countless women whose lives were consumed by duty, by disease, by neglect. Mary knew she was dying. She must have known it each time she struggled to breathe, each time she wiped blood from her lips. But perhaps, in some quiet corner of her mind, she also knew that her suffering was not hers alone. It was the fate of many. The silent illness was not only in her lungs, it was in the system itself. A system that demanded everything from her: beauty, loyalty, obedience, and gave nothing back but grief. By the early 1530s, Mary Tudor was a shadow of the woman she had once been. At Westhorpe Hall, her life slowed to a quiet rhythm, far from the blaze of court, far from the noise of politics. The great halls that had once echoed with laughter and music now carried the sound of her cough, the measured footsteps of attendants, the whispered prayers of children who did not yet understand that their mother was dying. Her daughters, Frances and Eleanor, were the light that kept her from complete despair. They were young, bright, full of energy. Frances, especially, reminded visitors of Mary's own beauty and youth. Sharp eyes, a proud bearing, a spark of wit that had once made her mother the jewel of Europe. Mary clung to her daughters, pouring into them what remained of her strength, perhaps even her regrets. She had known what it was to be traded like a coin. She had known what it was to marry for politics, to live under the shadow of men's decisions. She had also known the sweetness of love seized in defiance, and the bitterness of paying the price. To her daughters, she must have wished for something different. But in Tudor England, daughters were not spared the game. Charles Brandon remained at her side, though his life could not stop entirely for hers. He was a courtier, a soldier, a duke bound by duty to the king. He traveled often, served in Henry's campaigns, managed affairs. Mary, increasingly frail, could no longer accompany him. The distance between them grew, not from lack of love, but from the cruel demands of their stations. When he returned home, he found not the vibrant princess he had once married, but a woman struggling to rise from her bed. Her voice softened. Her body weakened. The marriage that had once defied a king now seemed marked by inevitability. Mary had chosen love, but love could not shield her from mortality. By this time, her presence at court was almost non-existent. Henry VIII was consumed with his own turmoil. The break with Catherine of Aragon, the marriage to Anne Boleyn, the looming rupture with Rome. He had little time or patience for a sickly sister living quietly in Suffolk. Mary's name appears rarely in the records of those years, mentioned only in passing, a distant figure fading from the story of her own family. It was an absence that hurt. For Mary, the court had once been her world. She had been admired, celebrated, whispered about in foreign reports. Now she was ignored. To be invisible after so much attention was its own form of cruelty. It was as though she had been erased before she had even died. Yet at Westhorpe, she still carried herself with dignity. Visitors described her as pale but composed. She dressed in black more often, the color of widowhood, as though she anticipated the end before it arrived. She kept her household orderly, saw to her children's education, maintained the remnants of her noble station. Illness could take her body, but she would not let it strip her of grace. Her faith deepened as her strength failed. In Tudor England, death was a constant presence. Children, mothers, kings, no one was spared. For Mary, raised in the Catholic traditions of her mother, Elizabeth of York, prayer became both comfort and anchor. She attended Mass when she could, listened when she could not, and filled her days with rosaries whispered between coughing fits. The illness, however, showed no mercy. Consumption is relentless. It hollows the lungs, weakens the bones, leaves the skin stretched thin over frail frames. Mary's attendants must have noticed her struggle to climb stairs, her frequent pauses for breath, her handkerchiefs stained with blood. Each sign was familiar, a grim reminder of what awaited. And yet, she endured. For 3 years she endured, moving slowly, growing weaker, but still holding her household together. It is in this endurance that one sees her strength most clearly, not in her days as a queen, not in her defiance when she married Charles Brandon, but in the quiet dignity of her decline. She did not rage, at least not publicly. She did not collapse into despair. Instead, she accepted the silence, the obscurity, the inevitability. In this, she reflected the fate of so many Tudor women, born to shine, forced to fade. By 1533, the year of Anne Boleyn's coronation, Mary was gravely ill. The contrast could not have been sharper. In London, trumpets blared, banners waved, the new queen walked beneath gilded canopies. In Suffolk, Mary Tudor lay in her bed, her body wasting, her daughters at her side. One sister crowned, another forgotten. One woman ascending, another sinking. Did she think of Henry, her brother? Did she resent his neglect, his obsession with Anne, his indifference to her suffering? Or had she already let go, tired of the game, unwilling to measure herself against a court that had long abandoned her? History leaves us only silence, but silence speaks. Those who saw her near the end described a woman serene but frail, her once famous beauty reduced to fragile outlines. The rose of the Tudor garden had become a pressed flower, delicate, fading, preserved only in memory. She was 37, young by any measure, too young to die, too young to be forgotten. And yet, in Tudor England, 37 could feel like the end of a long road. She had been a queen, she had been a scandal, she had been a mother, and now she was simply a woman waiting for her final breath. Her daughters watched. learning perhaps the most painful lesson of all: that crowns and titles cannot protect, that beauty cannot shield, that even love cannot save. Mary Tudor's final years were not marked by glory, but by endurance. She lived them not as a figure of spectacle, but as a human being, frail and finite. In those years, stripped of court, stripped of power, stripped of health, she became something she had never been allowed to be before. She became herself. June 25th, 1533. Westhorpe Hall lay hushed, its corridors heavy with the sound of muffled footsteps and distant prayers. Servants moved quietly, as though any loud sound might shatter what little strength remained in their mistress. Mary Tudor was dying. She was only 37. But her body was wasted, her lungs consumed, her beauty gone. The princess, once praised as the brightest flower of England, now lay pale and gaunt, her chest rising and falling with difficulty, each breath an effort, each cough a torment. Those around her knew the end was near. They had watched her decline for years. The bright days when she had walked with grace, dressed in velvet and jewels, seemed like another life. Now she could barely lift her head. Her daughters sat close. Frances, not yet 18, tried to stay composed, her youth forced into gravity by the sight of her mother's fading. Eleanor, younger still, clung to her hand, perhaps too young to fully understand, but old enough to sense the fear in the room. Charles Brandon was there too, the husband for whom she had risked everything, the man she had defied a king to marry. He stood at her bedside, helpless, silent, a soldier who had faced battlefields without flinching, now undone by the slow war consuming his wife's body. Love had brought them together, scandal had scarred them, debt had weighed them down, and now death came to part them. Outside, the world moved on. In London, Henry VIII celebrated his new marriage to Anne Boleyn. Trumpets blared, streets filled with pageantry, a new queen was crowned in triumph. England looked to the future with a mixture of awe and dread. But in Suffolk, there was no fanfare, no celebration, only silence. Mary's passing was a private tragedy, overshadowed by her brother's dramas. The court was too consumed with Anne and Catherine, with the Pope and Parliament, to care about a fading princess in the countryside. But for those within Westhorpe, her death was everything. The accounts are brief, almost cruelly so. They note only that she died on June 25th after a long decline. No elaborate details, no ornate description of final words, just a line, a fact, as though history could not spare more space for her end. But one can imagine the scene. The flicker of candles around the bed, the scent of incense or herbs meant to ease the air, the whispered Latin prayers of priests reciting the rites of the dying, the muffled sobs of attendants, loyal women who had served her for years. Mary, breathing shallowly, perhaps trying to focus on her daughters' faces, perhaps whispering words of love or regret or warning, perhaps too weak even for that. The silence growing heavier until it was broken only by the final exhale. And then she was gone. 37 years old. The bright star of Tudor beauty extinguished in quiet obscurity. Her death raised questions even then. Most assumed consumption, the slow wasting sickness. Others speculated about cancer, about complications from childbirth. But the truth hardly mattered. What mattered was that she had been taken too young, with too much life still unwritten. In that moment, the contrast was cruel. Her brother reigned as king, full of strength and appetite, reshaping his kingdom according to his will. Her nieces and nephews would one day fight for thrones, spilling blood across England. But Mary left quietly, forgotten almost before the candles around her bed had burned out. The silence of her death is haunting. She had been Queen of France, if only briefly. She had been the most admired woman in Europe. She had risked death for love, defied her brother, lived scandal and survival. And yet, at the end, her story closed with barely a whisper. Her body was prepared according to custom, dressed in black, shrouded with dignity, laid out for those who remained to pay respect. But it was a small gathering, not the grand spectacle of royal funerals. No massive crowds, no endless processions, no kings or queens mourning, only family, attendants, local dignitaries. A death fitting not for a queen, but for a duchess fading into history. And still, in that quiet hall, her presence must have lingered. The memories of her laughter, her wit, her beauty. The memory of a young girl raised as the jewel of England. The memory of a woman who had loved deeply, suffered quietly, and endured to the end. Her daughters lost a mother. Charles Brandon lost a wife. England lost a princess. But history barely paused. Perhaps that is the tragedy at the heart of Mary Tudor's death. Not only that she died young, but that her death was overshadowed, diminished, nearly erased. 37 years. That was all she was given. Not enough to carve her name in power. Not enough to shape destiny. Not enough to be remembered as she deserved. Mary Tudor died not in triumph, not in scandal, not in drama, but in silence. And sometimes silence is the cruelest epitaph of all. Death should have brought dignity. It should have brought solemn processions, candlelit vigils, the tolling of bells across the land. For a princess, for a former queen, for the sister of England's king, a funeral should have been a pageant of remembrance. But Mary Tudor's farewell was nothing of the sort. Her body was first taken to the great abbey of Bury St. Edmunds. Once among the most sacred sites in England, it was where kings had been buried, where pilgrims came in droves, where relics shimmered in golden shrines. For a moment, it seemed her memory would rest in grandeur. She was laid in solemn ceremony, draped in black velvet, surrounded by mourners who whispered prayers for her soul. Yet even this dignity was fleeting. England was changing. The 1530s were years of upheaval, of Henry's break with Rome, of monasteries falling one by one. Bury St. Edmunds, once a fortress of faith, became a target. When the abbey was dissolved under Henry's reforms, its shrine stripped and its wealth seized, Mary's resting place was disturbed. Her body did not remain in the sacred abbey. It was moved, displaced, shifted into a far humbler setting, St. Mary's Church in Bury St. Edmunds. A parish church, not a royal one. The transition spoke volumes. The great princess, the glittering queen, was no longer treated as a figure of majesty. She was quietly reburied in a modest tomb, tucked away from the grandeur she once embodied. The contrast is striking. Other Tudors had monuments, effigies, chantries carved in stone. Mary had none of that. No golden canopy, no marble sarcophagus, just a tomb that could easily be overlooked. A memorial almost too simple for a woman who had once been Queen of France. Her funeral, like her death, was overshadowed by her brother's drama. In 1533, the court was absorbed in the coronation of Anne Boleyn. All eyes were on London. Trumpets, pageants, processions. The kingdom was dazzled by its new queen. There was no room left for mourning in Suffolk. No courtly pilgrimage to grieve a fading princess. Mary's passing was barely noted outside her immediate circle. Imagine the scene. In St. Mary's Church, the air heavy with incense, a few priests chanting the Requiem. Her daughters, Frances and Eleanor, standing solemnly, their black veils hiding tears. Charles Brandon, stern-faced, perhaps trying to mask his grief with the stoicism of a soldier. Attendants kneeling, whispering prayers. Outside, the town continued its life. Markets opening, tradesmen shouting, children running in the streets. A queen buried, yet unnoticed. This is how history forgets. Not always with violence, but with silence. The years passed, and her tomb grew quieter still. Visitors to Bury St. Edmunds did not come for Mary Tudor. They came for the abbey, for relics, for the memory of saints. When the abbey fell, her memory fell with it. By the time she was moved into St. Mary's, her life was already fading into obscurity. Her final resting place is modest, a simple stone inscribed with her name. Generations passed by without pausing. Travelers might walk over the very spot of her grave and never know they were stepping on the dust of a Tudor princess, a former queen, the sister of Henry VIII. It is almost unthinkable. Here was a woman whose beauty had been described in glowing terms by Venetian envoys, whose marriage had once bound England and France, whose defiance had nearly cost her life. And yet, at her death, and in the centuries after, she became almost invisible. Part of this forgetting was deliberate. Henry had no interest in elevating her memory. She had defied him once. She had opposed Anne Boleyn. She had withdrawn from his court when he demanded loyalty. To celebrate her too loudly would be to honor resistance. Better to let her fade. And fade she did. When tourists visit Tudor sites today, they see the Tower of London, Hampton Court, Westminster Abbey. They hear the names of Henry, Anne, Elizabeth, Mary Warmers. But Mary Tudor, the sister, the forgotten princess, remains in shadow. Her grave is not a shrine, not a symbol, not a pilgrimage site. It is simply a stone, worn by centuries, almost apologetic in its presence. And yet, that modest tomb tells its own story. Not every royal death ends in triumph. Not every queen leaves a monument. Some, like Mary, leave only whispers. Her funeral, stripped of grandeur, her resting place diminished, becomes part of the greater tragedy of her life. She was born to shine, and she did, briefly, brilliantly. But she died and was buried as though her brilliance had never mattered. Perhaps there is something fitting in that. For Mary Tudor's life was always marked by contrasts. The glitter and the shadow, the crown and the chain, the love and the loss. Even in death, those contrasts remained. She had once walked in coronation processions, showered with petals, her beauty praised in song. But in the end, her funeral was quiet, her tomb humble, her memory almost erased. And that, too, is part of her epitaph. Mary Tudor, born to be admired, doomed to be forgotten. Mary Tudor's story ends not in fire, not in spectacle, but in silence. A silence so deep that even history itself seemed to turn away. She had been the most admired beauty of her time, a princess of England, a queen of France, a duchess who dared to marry for love. And yet she died at 37, remembered only faintly, her tomb modest, her legacy overshadowed by louder, bloodier Tudor dramas. But her life speaks still, if you listen. Mary was more than her beauty, more than her marriages, more than her title. She was the embodiment of the paradox faced by so many women of her age, celebrated yet controlled, adorned yet silenced, admired yet expendable. Her tragedy was not that she lacked admiration, but that admiration gave her no freedom. Born into the garden of Tudor politics, she bloomed too brightly. And the world, as it often does, plucked her for its own use. Her first marriage to Louis XII showed the cruelty of dynastic bargaining. A girl of 18 given to a man of 60. No choice, no voice, only duty. Her second marriage to Charles Brandon showed the cost of defiance. Love seized, yes, but at the price of scandal, fines, and lifelong debts. And her illness, slow, wasting, merciless, revealed the fragility behind the crown. Tuberculosis was the great leveler. It cared nothing for beauty, for titles, for politics. It consumed Mary as easily as it consumed peasants in the villages beyond her estates. The forgotten funeral sealed her fate. She was buried quietly, without grandeur, overshadowed by the rise of Anne Boleyn and her brother's relentless hunger for power. One princess faded as another queen ascended. Yet if we look closer, Mary's story is not only one of fading, it is a mirror. Her life reflects the larger truth of Tudor England, that women, no matter how high born, were pawns in the games of men, that beauty could open doors, but could also become a prison, that even the brightest roses wilt when roots are planted in soil that will never nourish them. Mary Tudor deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote, not as a pawn, but as a human being caught in the machinery of dynasty, who dared at least once to seize her own fate, and who paid dearly for it. Her epitaph is found not in stone, but in the line preserved by one who knew her. She was born to be admired, yet destined to suffer. And that is the story of Mary Tudor. When we strip away the jewels and crowns, what remains? A young woman, a sister, a wife, a mother, fragile, mortal, forgotten. Her life reminds us that history often celebrates the powerful, but forgets the broken. And it is in remembering the broken that we see the truth most clearly. If you want more untold stories of forgotten royals, silenced lives, and tragedies buried in the shadows of history, subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled.